Guys, welcome back. So today we begin our journey together through the Bible. Okay, and like I talked about in the last video, this is a very high level view, a 30,000 foot view of the Bible. My goal is to help you understand the entirety of the Bible so that when you get down into the Bible, you know where you're at. You know what came before it, what came after it, right? So that you are able to exegete it well. That just means simply understand it correctly, interpret it rightly. Right? That's very important when it comes to reading the Bible. Now, we'll spend more time in certain areas than we do in others. Just like if you were telling your testimony, right? You spend more time in certain areas. You highlight certain areas over others. The reason is it's important, right? It's important to get the message across. Now, the entirety of the Bible is important, yes. But there are certain areas because of the way in which we're going to cover it that I'm going to highlight and I'm going to spend more time on. Genesis is one of them. I think getting the beginning right is highly important. We will spend way more time in Genesis than we do Leviticus, right? Leviticus has a strong point when you understand it, but we're going to spend more time in Genesis than we do Leviticus, okay? So I just want to get that out there, all right? So now that you know. Now, if you're you have your Bibles with you today, and I would highly encourage you to have your Bibles or at least read over the chunk of the text that we're going to be talking about, and you must always do that, right? Do not take what I'm saying at face value. Don't just decide that it's right. Listen to me. Go back and read what I'm talking about. That's how you ought to always check the people that you're listening to, right? We have to get out of this just listening to people and regurgitating what they say. We need to start to think again, be critical thinkers again, and make sure that what I'm saying is correct. What's up, guys? I'm going to break into this video because I realized that I forgot to say this. I wish so much that in church services we had a Q&A at the end of it to bring clarity to so many things that people have when they have questions walking out of it, but we don't. I wish it was set up that way, but we don't. But I want to tell you, if you will ask your questions in the comments below, right, I will make sure that I have a Q&A session to every series that we do because my heartbeat is to bring clarity to the Word of God so that the people of God can know more about their God. That is my heartbeat. That is what I feel like God is calling me to do this for. So if you'll put your questions in the comments below, I will do a Q&A. Let's get back to the video. Okay, is correct. So the first thing that I think is very important when it comes to any book or any text that you are trying to understand is you need to know who is the author and who is the audience, right? Remember this, the Bible was written for you but not to you. It was written for you but not to you. There was an author to it, and obviously the author is ultimately God, but there's an actual person that's an author to these books, and there's an audience, meaning an intended people that they're writing to. And when you understand who the audience is, that will help you get the context of what the author is trying to convey. It will help you exegete it better. It will help you not get lost in the weeds by saying, oh, this means to me. The one thing I hate more than anything on earth is when I hear somebody go, well, that's your interpretation, but this is mine. Wrong. I don't care about your interpretation. I don't care about my interpretation. I care about the correct interpretation. And the way we get there is through the author and through the audience. So we're going to go ahead and have our Bibles on Genesis 1 and 2. We're going to cover all of 1 and 2 today. And we're going to cover the highlight moments of Genesis 1 and 2. One thing we need to say, Genesis 1 and 2 is mentioned 155 times, or Genesis is mentioned 155 times in the New Testament. Jesus himself mentions Genesis 1 through 11. No, Jesus mentions Genesis 6 times, and Genesis 1 through 11 is mentioned 100 times, right? So if you're wanting some kind of confirmation on does Genesis matter and is Genesis 1 through 11 important, there you go, right? 156 times in the New Testament, 1 through 11, 100 times. Jesus mentions it 6 times. Then Jesus himself says what? He says, the reason you don't listen to me and don't accept me is because you don't accept Moses, who was the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses, right? He's saying, you didn't listen to Moses, you're not going to listen to me, right? So there's your confirmation of the importance of the book of Genesis, okay? Of the book of Genesis. The author is Moses. The audience is the Exodus community. And that's going to carry weight, especially as we start talking downstream. I just want you to think about, what would the Exodus community be like? They would have been refugee slaves, right? Coming out of enslavement in Egypt for 400 years. What would that have done to their mindset? They would have been caught up in Egyptian culture. There's a reason why when we get into Exodus, right, that Aaron talked the people into making a golden calf, right? That's what they were used to. They were used to idols and multiple gods and all of these things, okay? So we're understanding the mindset of the Exodus community. We'll get more into that as we travel downstream. But we get to verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, okay? Right here, this is probably the most confrontational and offensive passage in the entire Bible. Why? Because it's telling you that God did it. God's in charge, right? It puts to rest atheism, the fact that there is no God. No, there is a God. Right here he is, and he did it. It's putting to rest the idea of agnosticism, that you just can't know. No, you can know. You know why? Because right here, a personal God did it. He told you that he did it. Puts to rest pantheism. Why? Because God is not everything. God is separate from his creation, and he is the creator, not a part of the creation. It puts to death materialism, right? The idea that matter is ultimate reality. No, it is not. There's a spiritual realm that is of greater reality than the physical realm itself. And it puts to death humanism, right? It puts that to rest, that reality is measured by humankind. Absolutely not. God is prime and ultimate reality. So all of those ideas that circulate in this world, especially materialism and humanism and agnosticism and atheism, and I use those because those are the most prevalent in the Western cultures, they're put to rest. You can continue to believe in them if you want, but God told us in the first verse of the Bible, no, those are not true. You choose to believe them, but they're not true, right? They're put to rest. And then we see this word, in the beginning, God, Elohim, right? And I'm not going to go too much into this. We'll cover more of this later. But this Elohim word has this plural nature to it. So right from the beginning, we're opened up to the idea of kind of this pluralism inside of God, right? Now, we don't want to cover too heavy in that. We don't want to make more of it than we should, but it is an option, right? At this point, you have to remember, Exodus community, they would have thought about a lot of gods, right? So God's opened up to the idea of the Trinity. Now, again, we're not at the Trinity yet here, but we're opened up to it, okay, in this plural word, Elohim. Then we get to verse 2, and we see this highly artistic way that God is going to talk about the way he brought the earth into order. Okay, he says, now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And so we see that what God does here is God gives form to the chaos, right? He gives form to the chaos, and then he fills it up and he gives it order. Right? And this is very important, okay? So the Spirit and presence of God does this. The Spirit and presence of God does this. We have the expanse, we have the sky and the sea, and then we have the land, right? And what does God do? He creates those things, and then he fills it up. He puts the stars, the moon, and the sun in the heavens, and then he puts the birds and the fish and the sea animals in the sea, and then he fills up the land with the beast, and ultimately with man. And then it says on the seventh day that he rested, right? God rested. And that word rested could also be understood as ruled. He rested and he ruled over all of his creation. And we're going to see this pattern, this 7-day pattern, and these numbers play out, because patterns and numbers are a big deal in the Bible, especially in the Hebrew language and the way in which God communicates, right? Math is a big deal. We'll talk about more of that downstream. We'll see more of that. So keep that 7-day pattern in the back of your mind. Next, we need to understand that this is a different cosmogony than all the other stories. And cosmogony simply means origin story. It's just different, right? And we have to remember that it is a polemic against all the other stories that the Exodus community would have known. And what I mean by a polemic is a critical attitude, a critical attack towards all the other stories. So yes, in one sense, God is telling you how he made the world, but he's also giving a counter story to all the other lies that the Exodus community would have been believing in, all the other counterfeit origin stories. So he's putting them to death in the same way that you're going to see him do this when it comes to the Exodus, right? It's a polemic against the Exodus, and the plagues are a polemic against the Egyptian gods, right? And the gods that they believed in. So this is not the only time God does this. God likes to give these polemics against the other things that people are believing in. And I think it's because contrast brings clarity, right? Contrast brings clarity, right? So if I have a story here and then I have a contrasting story, that brings clarity to what is true, okay? And all of life, okay? So remember, again, Moses was raised in Egypt, right? So he was the perfect candidate. God used him from his birth until this point. He was already planning that Moses would be the person to do this because he was raised, the book of Acts tells us, in all the things of Egypt, right? He was raised under the Pharaoh, and he would have known all of these stories. He would have been well educated in this. So this is intended to tell us how God made the world, but also give the counterpoints. I'll give you one quick idea. I'm not going to go into all of these because this would be a very long video if I did. But Enuma Elish, right? That's another cosmogony, another origin story that the Exodus community would have been familiar with. It's a story of Marmaduke, right? And Marmaduke destroying Tiamat and taking the sea goddess. And the sea in the ancient Near Middle East always represented chaos, and Marmaduke slays the sea goddess, and he splits her carcass, and he makes the heavens and the earth. And then we have the junior gods, right? The junior gods who are having to work, and all of a sudden they don't want to work, they want to be in leisure. And so what do? Well, we create mankind, and mankind all of a sudden becomes the work so that the junior gods can be at leisure, right? That is an anthropology that was taught in Egypt. Well, that seems very convenient for the Pharaoh, right? The Pharaoh, I am the image of God. The Pharaoh, I'm the image of God. And this is your story. This is your true story. Humans, you're supposed to be workers in my cog. And you're doing it for the gods, so make sure that you do it well. Right? That's a very convenient story. And we're going to see that Moses tells a very different story. So when you read that, right? When you read the chaos and the fighting amongst the gods, and this is how the world was created, it's very chaotic. It's very disordered, right? But that's not how God creates it all, right? When we're going through the creation story of God, the way Moses tells it is he said, God simply speaks. It's not a battle of the gods. God just speaks it. And guess what? His creation responds, right? God speaks and things respond to him speaking. He also says it was good. Right? It wasn't chaotic and disordered. It was good when God did it. It has a moral quality to it that is good, right? That is good. And one thing I want to say here before we go any further is the idea of correspondence and differences, right? Because you're going to see in the creation story and origin stories, you're going to see in the flood narrative, you're going to see that there is some correspondence, meaning some similarities when it comes to ancient Near Eastern stories, but you're also going to see some massive differences, right? So there's going to be some similarities, but some major differences. And the reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of people like to say, see, look at the similarities there. They just copied it. And I'm like, no, that's kind of silly, right? That's not what we care about when we're hearing about stories today, right? If the FBI comes and grabs two people, they're not as much concerned about the similarities as they are the differences and who's lying and who's telling the truth, right? That's what's important. It's the differences that kind of elevate one story or the other, okay? And so you're going to see some very, very massive differences, especially in anthropology, right? That would have put Genesis in a class of its own. Right? The idea that Genesis says you were made in the image of God is very different than other stories, right? And very inconvenient for rulers, by the way. Hey, you're not a cog in Pharaoh's machine. You're made in the image of God. Not just Pharaoh, you are. All of mankind is made in his image. You all have the same kind of value that Pharaoh says he has. That's a very inconvenient story, right? For rulers and leaders back in those days, okay? Back in those days. So what we see is the worldview that Moses is giving the Exodus community is a creational monotheism, right? It's creational monotheism. And he's saying, this is your God. He speaks and the world responds. That is his power. He speaks and the world responds. He made everything good, and you are not slaves. That is not your identity. That is not who you are. Get that out of your head. And so we see that God has given a covenantal shape of reality when it comes to mankind. So we see covenant from the very beginning in creation and how God is creating things. And so let's get back to anthropology, meaning the humankind, who we are as humans and who God says we are. He says that we are made in the image of God. We are not refuse slaves for Pharaoh's production, right? That is not who you are. And I, your God, have given you orders. Pharaoh's orders are not what you're called to follow out. You are not called to build his empire here on earth and spread the image of Pharaoh. You are called to build my empire here on earth, and I'm going to tell you how to do that, right? You're going to expand the borders of the garden, right? You're going to spread my image over the whole earth, and here are your marching orders. Subdue the earth. What? That's not what you tell slaves. Subdue the earth. Rule over it with me. Right? With me. The dialogue itself that God is giving, the dialogue, it already is like, it's indicative of intimacy, right? It's indicative of intimacy. The dialogue that he's having. He says, be fruitful and multiply my image over the whole earth. He says, have communion with me, as we see that he walks in the garden with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day at the end of it. So we see this communion that's taking place. And so what we have is we have this picture of royalty. We have this picture of a palace, right? Of the ancient Near Eastern gardens, right? If you go back in, what was it, Marvel, where at the end of it, Thor or whatever, not Thor, but the bad guy, he's in a garden, right? That was indicative of ancient Near Eastern. They were big people of gardens, right? That's why we have the garden. The Exodus community would have understood this language, right? God's communicating to them in such a way. He's accommodating himself to where they can understand it, but then he's also fixing the bad ideas that they have coming out of Egypt. And he's saying, you are my vice regents, right? You are my vice regents. And so we see that God is also accommodating himself in the way that they would have understood ancient Near Eastern kings, right? What did kings do on the earth back then to make sure that people knew that they were in charge? Well, number one, they would put statues, right? Statues would go up of them, and you would walk into that city or town and you go, that's who's in charge. There's his statue. They would build temples, right? They would have a law or a code, and they would do all of these things. And this is exactly what God's doing from the very beginning. He's giving all those things, and then he's saying, go duplicate this. Go show the whole world who's in charge by doing this, and do it in such a way that it conforms to my character, right? Not your image, my image, and go do it over the whole earth. And so we see that they are told not to be in isolation in the garden. No, expand the garden over the whole earth. Don't stay in the garden. It's about expansion. It's about empire building. But you're building God's empire, God's kingdom here on the earth. And then he says, God gave him a helpmate, right? God gave him a helpmate. And the way in which God gave him a helpmate was beautiful, right? God shows the fatherhood of God. He didn't just say, hey, Adam, this is woman. She's your helpmate. Go. No, he says, hey, Adam, let's name the animals. Go ahead, start giving them names, right? And Adam's naming the animals is, okay, that's good, Adam. Whatever. right? But he allows Adam to do this, and he doesn't change Adam the way he's naming them. He didn't go, that's not a good one, Adam. I'm going to name it this. No, he lets him take part in the created order, right? So he's bringing Adam in and saying, you're my vice regent. Here, I'm going to let you do some things here. But then he also lets Adam learn for himself that there is no animal out there that is a suitable helper for him. Right? So he's taking part in the process of having Adam to learn these things. It's beautiful, right? The same way I want to father my child. Right? I don't want to tell him everything. I want to walk alongside of him and help him learn it and make sure that he learns it correctly. Right? And so we see that God gives man, woman, and she corresponds to man, and they reflect God's image together. Right? Not just in marriage, but in relationship, right? Man and woman just in relationship. If you're married or not married, it doesn't matter. You still need to be in relationship with woman and be in relationship with man correctly, right? Not sexually until marriage, but correctly. We'll talk more about that downstream, why God has ordered it this way. And so we see that God has a particular order for mankind. right, for man and for woman, and he has particular roles for them to play so that you can know more of God, right? There's a certain part of a man that can't know certain things about God without a woman, and there's certain parts of a woman that can't know certain things about God without a man. And so we correspond to one another, and our roles matter. It's not by coincidence that the enemy of man's soul is trying to muddy the waters when it comes to the role of man and woman in our world today. Why? Because he hates for man to have a knowledge of God. He wants you not to have a knowledge of God. And so it is not also by coincidence that we will see that the first thing that the enemy does when it comes to bringing sin into the world is subverts the roles, the order of things when it comes to man and woman. And we will wrap this up with saying that at the end, God says that he had made everything and he had made it good. And we see that Adam and Eve are in the garden and they are naked and unashamed. I'll see you in the next video.